So this originally sort of started off as whether there could be a discussion about how do we help people to learn about practicing systems thinking. And I'm deliberately using the word practicing systems thinking rather than just knowing about systems thinking because uh, I do view that there's a huge gulf between one and t'other. So I wanted to explore some ideas and then see what resulted from that and where and does it lead anywhere? Is there anything we can continue to explore about this? Um, so So my first thoughts were firstly that practicing systems thinking in itself is messy because the situations we inhabit are messy and the language of practice can be messy. And also the landscape of practitioners and bodies and evangelists and methods and educational providers is complex. So you kind of see where I'm going here. It's all very messy and all very interwoven. So, so the question I was sort of going was, how do we learn about how to practice? How is that different from teaching? And what opportunities are there out there for learning and how we do it? And then one of the things that's always worried me, because I came into systems thinking from process management. So I did process management for over 20 years with BT into global services, which is a complex business in its own right across 150 countries. So you can imagine its processes were just labyrinthine at times, and working on them was a bit of a nightmare. Because the moment you started working on them, people sort of thought, oh, you're just a technocrat. We just need processes that work. And again, yes, that's what I'm trying to do. Um, but I realized that it was a big risk in the process management world. And I think it's a big risk in the systems thinking world. And I was having an argument recently with someone on LinkedIn about this saying, oh, VSM doesn't work. And I just go, where's your evidence? Where's the evidence? And I said, well, I've got lots of evidence that it does work. So where's yours that it doesn't? Other than, are you just being an opinionated logical positivist? Whereas I'm actually asking questions about where's the evidence. But it's so easy for this whole area of systems thinking just to descend into technocracy. People go, oh, well, it's all about tools. And we're going, no, it's not actually. But how do we kind of also not prejudice what we actually do by people coming to very fixed views about what they think it is, and perhaps that it really shouldn't be. So I had a number of questions floating around in my mind. And you're not supposed to be able to read the blobs on this chart, other than the one in the middle that says SCiO, um, uh, because this was an attempt a couple of years ago to try and make some sense of the landscape of systems practice. And we realized just how blooming messy it actually is. This is actually, I think, in Kumu or something like that. If you want to go and have a look at it, it's in my Kumu domain. But it was to try and get at the idea that there were various different artifacts involved in systems thinking. There were professional bodies, there were practitioners, there were sort of educational providers, there were evangelists, and there were platforms on which sort of things sat that we all sort of used and accessed. And the red blob SCiO, I deliberately put big black letters in the middle of it so you could sort of see where SCiO sat. And obviously we're connected to a whole bunch of different things, including various other different bodies and some artifacts and some practitioners, and a number of other different institutions. So as you can see, there are a whole bunch of practitioners over in the pink. Not many platforms by which things happen, which is possibly a good thing because you don't necessarily want too many competing platforms for which you do things. It was slightly interesting that some of the platforms we identified that people might use, we couldn't figure out how people connected to, which was a slightly strange outcome. And we also identified a number of teaching and learning institutions and evangelists, and we're not quite sure how those are connected either. So it was definitely a messy picture, and we sort of realized, well, SCiO is sort of in the middle of this web of stuff. And if we're trying to help sort of practitioners work better, then we need to realize that it's a very, very complex space that we're working in, and then how to sort of navigate that learning that we try and engender for people who do systems thinking. So that was a sort of starting point for, oh my gosh, look at this. When we broke that down, and we did, we were able to sort of identify these domains in a little bit more structure. So this is a systems map that arose from that original extremely messy diagram. And there was a couple of things we said they were just too difficult to try and do work on. One was methods and methodologies because there's so much argument about them. And the other one is organizational applications because they can just be anything and everything. But we realized there were a whole bunch of different practitioner community platforms, evangelists, artifacts, the professional bodies. And what I was going to focus on, and which are the two sort of blobs on the right-hand side, were the ones around practitioners themselves and where they sat, and also then teaching and learning institutions. So we kind of model how do those interconnect? How does the learning experience work through those? So it feels like yes, there is there are distinct domains to practice. And what was really intriguing at the time when we first did this mapping is we didn't find a direct link between teaching and learning institutions as a systems map. There was no structural overlap at the time. But I mean, there probably is more now that we're sort of into the apprenticeship and how that functions. But it's, again, a very complicated structural picture of all the different players. And then, of course, if you take a sample just of the current programs that you've got out there of people who provide systems thinking systems thinking stuff. And I tried to take a view that sort of said, well, there's a whole bunch of people who do things in the UK. So on the bottom right-hand side, there is the apprenticeship providers page that is on the SCiO website, which has a large number of, has at least 9 organizations on it. And on the bottom, on the left-hand side, there's the little sort of systems practice courses that SCiO does. And then we had, well, you can study with the OU, or you can go and get stuff from Systems Innovation Network. But also, if you look globally, which is effectively how people can look at this, you've got Systems Change, the Academy of Systems Change. You've got the Water Centre. You've got places like the University of Hull. So it's a kind of hodgepodge of all sorts of different stuff. And I was going, well, how does this actually relate to a practitioner? Because there's a hell of a lot of stuff here. So if you're a practitioner going, I want to learn about some of this, where do you go and why do you go to the place that you go? Is the question that arose in my mind, having looked at all these different sales pitches, because effectively these are all, in a way, sales pitches for come here and learn about systems thinking. And I kind of went, oh my God, what a mess. And then I thought, I started going into things that I kind of was familiar with over time. So are people familiar with the old idea of T-shaping as a pattern of learning? So I mean, it's a very long-standing skills and training design orthodoxy. And it started in the 80s with McKinsey's. And then IDEO pitched in the 90s. And so I had a question of, well, seeing as that HR still seems to sort of talk about it occasionally, I kind of went, well, is it actually useful and good for us as practitioners? So I realized that T-shaping was the idea that if you were in a domain of practice, that you should understand broadly almost everything in the discipline, at a very broad level. So, for example, I should understand what stakeholder management was, or I should understand how integration worked or whatever. And then you would have one deep spike of deep knowledge that you would need to develop. And that would be what typified you as a practitioner. Now, I'm not even going to ask the question about whether it's suitable for us yet. But then I realized there was another thing called pie shaping, which actually said, no, one wasn't enough for the average consulting practitioner working in a domain. You needed at least 2. So therefore, that's where the kind of pie shape came from the pie symbol. And then I was going, well, what is the shaping that works for us? Is there one? What does it look like? So I was left with a question of, well, T-shaping doesn't feel adequate because it's just like one thing. And pie shaping might be a good place to go. But again, is that still right? And is there a shape that seems to be right for the systems thinking community? So that was sort of part of my journey. And then I started to go, well, hold on. If I go into things like the apprenticeship standard, it actually defines a little bit about how this might work. So there's an expectation, if I just look at the little symbol in the middle, that there is a sort of broad understanding of stuff from left to right, which is sort of your shallow understanding of what all the terminology means. And if someone asks you about, well, are you going to do Conan or something like that, confrontation analysis, you kind of go, I kind of know what it is, but I don't know how to do it. But at least you know what they're talking about when they ask about it. How do you deal with confrontations? Oh, okay, well, there's a method to this with that. I don't do that, but I know someone who does. And the apprenticeship standard sets in place for, at least for England, and through the SCiO competency frame, some expectations. It says that you should have a sound working knowledge. That just does not mean I know what the words mean. It means you can do this stuff of at least 3 modeling of approaches as defined in the competency framework, including at least 2 of the widely used systems methodologies or approaches. So CSH, soft systems, FIOP, systems dynamics, and VSM. So at least 2 and maybe 3, or even 4 if you're a clever clogs, because I don't know anybody who can do all 4 of them. And even Patrick, who's an amazing systems thinking practitioner, doesn't think that he can do all 4 of those. So that just shows you the scale of what's going on. So where does that leave our T-shaping and our pie shaping? Well, interesting. It doesn't actually end there, though, because in fact, there aren't just 4 methodologies in the systems thinking part of the standard. There are 13. So not only have you got the ones that are in bold, CSH, SSM, SD, and VSM, you've got Conan, informed, interactive management, interactive planning, mosaic, which is the change management part of systemic change management, multi-methodology, which is a combination of whether that's Mike Jackson's SOSM or whether that's Ray Eiston's approach to practitioner framework method and situation. Socio-technical systems, which is interesting, Ed, just to follow on what you're talking about. There is actually a method for socio-technical systems exploration and evaluation, and syntegration, which is the Malik method, which is sort of Stafford Beer's original stuff. So there are in fact 13 on top of also 9 additional ones on top of the 4 core ones that are in the standard. So you might want to be able to practice, well, any of those really. So how does one get a grasp of what do I actually want to focus on and what am I interested in? Oh, and I wish it ended there, because it doesn't. The standard goes on. It also talks about, well, should have a working knowledge of at least 2 methods or methodologies for intervention, planning, information gathering, engagement, and change implementation. And by the way, when you look at the competency framework, there are 50 different intervention skills mentioned on that listing. So actually, you've got 4 core things, another 9 extra things, and then up to 50 things on top of that, which you should be able to do like at least 2. And you start going, well, okay, so T-shaping and pie shaping really doesn't cut it anymore, does it? It really, you really can't go, well, we could adopt that sort of strategy to how we developed as a practitioner. And unfortunately, even that's not the end of the story. It goes further. So this is another diagram which we kind of did a few years ago, but slightly tries to, this is another glorious little thing that I think we threw into Kumu because it was about the only place I could model it. Which was like trying to do with all the relationships of all the different things you were trying to understand in this systemic inquiry can be difficult. So if you think about there are sort of 3 things, core things in the middle. There's the problematic situation or system of interest or situation of interest, depending on whose language you wish to use. There is a system of interest, which is one of the things that's contained within the problematic situation, but it could be more. So it contains N, i.e. there is more than one of these. The system of interest, of course, contains multiple processes, and the processes flow across N organizational functions. And then you find that there are all sorts of attributes of things that then relate to problematic situation, process, system of interest, organizational function, Some of which then, of course, pop up into your language because change, of course, being mosaic change or organizational change, then affects system of interest, organizational function, and process. Um, and then you have assets of processes, directions of processes, sequences, decompositions. Actors affect your systems of interest and your process. Um, You've then got beneficiaries of a process and or a system. You've got purposes, you have goals, relationships, boundaries, perspectives, recursions, feedback, all sorts of things then are attributes of some of these different pieces. And guess what? As practitioners, we kind of need to make sense in systemic inquiry of any or all of these things. This is not an easy landscape for a practitioner to kind of make sense of. So how on earth do you prepare someone to deal with this? So that's kind of a messy diagram. If you have any questions, are there any questions about the last couple of pictures and things before I move on? So I think I've just thrown a lot of stuff at you in the last few minutes. But it doesn't matter if there aren't. We can come back to pictures if you want to ask questions at the end.
I just was thinking about that tea and pie thing, which I haven't come. That's not something that was familiar to me. And
This
my
one.
immediate, my immediate sort of inner Bolshe person was going, who defines this, the breadth and the depth anyway, if you know what I mean? Which of course you've gone on to do a little bit for the practitioner standard, which it makes sense. But it just sounds a bit. I don't know. I'm wondering if I'm just having a kind of anti-HR thing without realizing it. But it did strike me as being, well, it's all very easy to draw and say this, but actually, I wonder what it really means in real. You know.
I think if I think about T-shaping and go back to when it kind of originated and where it originated, it kind of originated because it originated with McKinsey's. The idea was, and of course this was jumped on by lots of people who then it became a bit of a fad for how you did skills mapping for people. And I did it myself for people in my team when I was part of BT. That they sort of said, well, if you're a consultant, you need to kind of understand lots of things broadly, but have one thing which is your sort of USP as a consultant, which you can do deeply. And that was kind of like the starting point. And and perhaps 40 years ago that was okay when the world was less complex and messy and interconnected that we think about. If I think about the 1980s, we were still sending faxes and using teleprinters and we weren't having video conferencing was an extraordinary luxury that you had if you were the chief exec. And then, of course, pie shaping then grew out of that because people realized that perhaps one deep skill area wasn't enough anymore. And the world was getting more tricky to deal with. And so you needed a bit more than just one. And of course, it's never really moved on. And of course, then we sort of hit the ground and and you start looking at, that. Sorry, this one. And you realize, well, hold on, well, T and pie shaping doesn't really cut it anymore, does it? Not on top of all the challenge of actually getting your head around something like that, which is sort of all the different things you might need to take into account when you're doing a systemic inquiry. If I just think about that, because this was just an illustration of something, what I also realized in thinking about this particular problem or problematic area was actually that the shaping wasn't consistent because no situation of interest in the complex world is like any other. So the level of depth and adoption that you have to have of all these things is, of course, adapting to your situation of interest and the system of interest you're then going to explore. So whilst the kind of the black bar across the top that says you should have a broad knowledge of your discipline area is pretty much the same, each and every practitioner will be, have demands placed on them depending on the situation they are presented with, which of course could be, if I take the top left one, a couple of systems approaches, couple of core systems approaches and a bit of intervention, or the top right one, sort of more intervention stuff and one of the expanded sort of extra 9 systems approaches, or the one over there. We don't need as much core. We need one of the expanded ones, but it could be as messy as the one on the right, which is perhaps a couple of core and loads of intervention stuff, because that's what's going on in the space. Now, obviously, people do form teams to go and do stuff, but we're a bit of a rarefied skill set. So sometimes you don't have that teamy thing. We don't have the luxury of McKinsey's being able to form teams of consultants to go into a situation because there aren't that many of us. So how do you actually make sense of this, which is an extreme, there is huge variety in the situations of interest and the systems of interest that underpin that. And of course, that means that there's huge variety affecting us as practitioners. So then how do you go about creating, the capability to go and play in that space meaningfully? Sometimes when your level of depth of something that you find is really attractive and comfortable is challenged by the situation. So, and I've come across this personally, and the reason I think this is relevant is that if I've looked at a number of situations, I know VSM quite well because Patrick taught me VSM years and years and years ago. The thing we don't want to do as practitioners is to have, John Seddon's terrible word, tool heads, which I mean, he meant it pejoratively, and I think it's still used largely pejoratively, which is that I know VSM, so therefore I've walked into situations, so I have my spanner, and so everything looks like a nut. And therefore, because I know VSM, I'm going to tackle the situation with VSM because that's what I feel comfortable doing. Whereas I might look at the situation and go, actually, I'm stumped here because VSM doesn't cut it. I know that it doesn't cut it, and I need to find help, either someone who will bring along some tooling or methods that will make sense of the situation, but not to pretend that because I'm there using with VSM, I can do it with VSM. And that's part of the challenge that I think we're faced with, because sometimes as humans, we don't want to admit, oh, I can't do this. But actually, that might actually be the best thing for the situation. And I think that affects everyone who is learning about systems thinking practice. Whether you're learning from the beginning, as walked in through the door as an apprentice with absolutely zero knowledge of any of this, or you might have been around for 10 years and you know VSM really well, but you suddenly realize I now need to learn critical systems heuristics because that's what's something that will help my situation. So it actually doesn't matter where you are. You're going to come across something interesting. The neo-generalist, I might go and check that out, Richard. Thank you for that. So this situation affects all of us all the time because situations of interest have variety. Therefore, Ashby's law applies to us as practitioners. So we need to have more variety than the situations which we're presented with, which can be tricky. So I started thinking about, well, is there a way of thinking about the system of learning for practitioners, systems thinking practice in the UK, and initially just in the UK? Could I just make sense of it in the UK? And I color coded it for a reason, because I sort of thought, well, things that are in green are sort of there, which they can be drawn upon and used by people. Things that in amber felt, okay, that's sort of a bit shonky, or it isn't really there, or doesn't work properly. And things that I marked out as being in red, I went, that really isn't, I don't think that's there at all. It just looks like a huge gap. And if I start with system one, we've sort of got a bunch of system one primary activities. If I think about a viable system for systems thinking practitioner learning, there are 4 things that feel like they're there now. Academic programs, which are straight academic programs such as the OU and Hull. Academic apprenticeship provision, which so JGA, Strathclyde, Exeter, Leeds, Choate, Simmons, etc. Professional bodies are there doing their things, as learning spaces for practitioners. And then you've got a whole bunch of organizations who do a collection of standalone modules, which you could just go and do and learn about. Some of which, to be honest, do tackle the black layer across the top of, thin knowledge, but at least helps you understand what the words are. And then in system one, I realized there's a huge gap because nobody's teaching children and young people about systems thinking in this country whatsoever. They do in Finland, we do not. If anything, we tend to sort of say, well, don't just do the blooming curriculum. Never mind that it doesn't have any systemic thinking in it. So that felt like a huge gap. And of course, you don't even have any draw upon that. There's no parents or communities going, that's actually a huge gap, and I want to get a grip on it. And we don't really have any pull from NGOs for the core things that are in the system ones either. We do have businesses and public services and government, for example, now Go Science, and some consultants and some practitioners going, I'd like some of this stuff, please. So that's sort of at the bottom of the model. We've got some system one and we've got some draw of it. So then we can go off and explore, well, how do the other bits work? So if I think about how does the management of it work, the operations management, we've got individual system one organizations largely managing their own domains. So, if something was pushed really hard, i.e. the apprenticeship provision was well oversubscribed, there's no way of flexing anything because all the system ones operate largely independently. So therefore, if we went over capacity or under capacity on any, there's no flex in any direction of any of that. Similarly, the only coordination you've really got is a bit of professional body outreach and interworking, but it's all voluntary. So there's nothing that actually properly glues it together. And then you've got the Skills England committees, which are all wondering what the hell's going on because you've got some people in government at the moment who are going level 7 apprenticeships are a waste of time. So that's not exactly motivating. It's not a good space to be in if you're doing this. And also your monitoring largely consists of Ofsted and Ofqual for qualifications only. So there's probably no monitoring of standalone modules. By the way, a lot of the standalone modules that are in this system one, even though I said it's in the UK, are international ones, some of which come from California or various different parts of the world. But because we have the internet, it doesn't matter. You could be sitting, you can be sitting in a village in Little Pever and you're doing a course of the water centre. And so what? It doesn't really matter. You're still a learner. And so you can do stuff anywhere for any reason. Then we've got development, which each system one pretty much develops their own content with in some cases, some professional body support, but there's no real sort of any proper management of it. And there is some pull, i.e. employers through Skills England do some of that, government through Go Science are going to do some of that. There's probably no community draw and there's probably no NGO draw. And the reason I put, by the way, NGOs up there, whether they're UK NGOs or global NGOs like the United Nations and their sub-bodies, is guess what? They're ones dealing with extremely complex, problematic situations that often need this discipline set, but they don't know that. So if anyone ever studies institutional development, I did with the OU, you see that straight up front. The problems they are dealing with, whether you're the World Health Organization or UNRWA or anybody else, their problems are incredibly complex. They do not approach their problems systemically. They approach them using standard frameworks, benchmarks, but problem, this worked over here, so I'll go and slap it over somewhere else. So you've got people trying to take a solution they developed for Bangkok and slap it in somewhere in, Guyana and wonder why it doesn't blooming work. So here's another problem and another opportunity. Also, if I then think about the kind of policy and strategy area, well, who and how was the first thing that sprung to mind? Is that ISSS, IFSR collective governance? How does that actually work in a collegiate way rather than a dominating way, knowing some of the personalities that we now know operate at some of those governance bodies? So there is no sort of effective sort of governance or joining up of any of this stuff. It just happens to have bubbled up, and yet you've still got people sniping in the background to go, oh, this stuff doesn't work. The LinkedIn trolls are still out there. So my sort of my VSM exploration of it was not encouraging, and led me to believe that actually, you know, if I think about it, yes, there is some stuff in S1 and there are some clear environmental draw upon that. But actually, if you wanted to have better linkages um, as a learning system for practitioners, even in the UK, um, we need to do a lot better than we do now. Even then, considering really strictly speaking, some things like apprenticeship are only really in England. So if you're in Scotland or you have a Scotland headquartered organization, you don't get the same apprenticeship, even though we spent a stack load of time and effort building it for anywhere, it only operates in England. That feels like a really stupid, not joined up thing. I think, Des, you've asked an interesting question um, in here. Is there something about our choice in relation to how we're coupled to our environment? Um, I think it would be quite interesting to go and do a patterns of strategy. We've done a little bit as SCiO of patterns of strategy, exploring this space, but I don't think we've explored it. I think we explored it as SCiO in relation to our environment rather than exploring, you know, systems thinking practitioner learning as a sort of meta system to SCiO. And I think it would be quite interesting to do that upwards look. As Patrick often says about systems thinking, we're very quick to go down into the problem and very slow to go back upwards and look at the context of it. So yeah, an interesting question. Should we do a POS on systems thinking practitioner learning in the current environment? I think would be a really interesting thing to do because we are coupled, absolutely coupled. Um, if I then go on and think about what can practitioners access for learning? Well, here's where it starts getting interesting because I've put my little diagram up again. I'm calling this the cone model, by the way, because it's got lots of teeth. So you had the T shaping and the pie shaping, and mine's the cone shaping for systems thinking practitioner learning. So the offering, so when I looked at all of this and then thought about the VSM, I realized that we addressed some of the potential need, but not in a joined up way. So if I just think about the black strand across the top, which gives you the broad understanding of all the terminology and all the other guff associated with it, there is a wide range of knowledge sources, but some of these are very shallow. They're information cards and overviews. They're useful, they're brief in most cases, but they are not practice. And maybe that's okay. It might be okay because they might just be about giving you knowledge so that you then can learn about the things which you actually can practice. So, but we have to be wary of them because an awful lot of them, there's hundreds and hundreds of different sources of shallow, broad information card, nice stuff to have, you know. I mean, I've got some of it here in, you know, at my desk, like I've got the water center sort of information cards about systems practice, and they're really nice. I mean, this is the water center habits of a systems thinker tools to help you think. Can I practice with these? No. They're good as a reminder, but they're no better for practice than say Brian Eno's oblique strategies cards for that purpose. So, you know, we have to just think about it's good for something, but just be careful about what it is. If I go off to the bottom left, then we have a whole bunch of specialist single subject learning or via the apprenticeship, effectively in England from all providers or from SCiO directly, i.e. as electronic courses. Nearly always cover the theory, but not always the practice. And not every single course that's in that space that's a specialist single subject learning is practice oriented. An awful lot of them are, which is great, but they are not all practice oriented. If I then think about the really deep ones, we have the ability for people as learners to go to in-depth academic research, typical single subject with a high end qualification at the end. So this is people going for their PhDs. Will cover theory, but quite often not practice. So you can, in theory, walk out with a PhD in viable systems, but not able to practice. That seems a little scary to me if you're a possible client of someone who might pitch on that basis. Then we have the 13, the wider sort of set of systems thinking. So again, a whole bunch of specialist single subject learning, or via the apprenticeship from a limited set of providers, or again from SCiO if you want to do the video courses. That may cover the theory, but not always the practice. So depending on who you go with or what you're picking up, so if you go and do a course on Conan, which you can probably do, you won't necessarily get to practice on all the courses that you'll go on, but you may have done a subject, and you may have understood a little bit more depth. But whether you can practice depends on the course. So there's not really a standard for any of that. And then if I look at the intervention, then that's an extremely messy place. It's a massive range of sources, many, whilst offering a systematic method for their things. So if you look at stakeholder mapping or something like that, it's a systematic approach to stakeholder mapping, but it rarely comes with a systemic inquiry focus. So it might be sort of, I know how to do stakeholder mapping, but you're doing it in a sort of a technology project background. Is that a systemic inquiry? Probably not, because normally those don't come with it. I need to understand the system that surrounds it. So again, it may cover some theory, but not always practice. So, if I look through across my comb, there's a whole bunch of things, sometimes cover the theory, sometimes cover the practice, but there is no governance or standard that says it should always do that. There's only one place where that exists, and that is effectively the Apprenticeship for Systems Thinking Level 7 that operates in England. It's the only standard I actually know worldwide that requires an education to practitioner level at the end. Nothing anywhere else in the world that I'm aware of that does that, full stop. So where does that leave us? Well, that leaves me, having investigated and explored this space a little bit, with a feeling that there is so much more to understand. That firstly, how are decisions made about systems thinking, practice learning at the macro or the micro level? Don't know how that happens. What's a good trajectory for learners, and what destinations are there? Trajectory and destinations seem important if you're a practitioner and you're trying to figure out what am I doing this for? Why am I subjecting myself to this? Where am I going to get as a result? Other than some cases thrown out the organization because they can't handle the questions you now ask. What are the dynamics and shifts and changes in the situation? So what is going on? So, so not only, do we went from T shaping to pie shaping to my comb shaping, but what's happening within that? And then a question that came all the way back when I did that really messy picture right at the beginning, one of the blobs on there was this idea of lay doers, i.e. people who actually do systems thinking naturally without even having any methods. How do we learn from their experience or their wisdom? And of course, is the wisdom worth it? People talk about the wisdom of the crowd, and I sometimes go, does the crowd have any wisdom? Is an interesting question. But there are people who are arguably lay doers. They just pick this stuff up and they just do it without even understanding any methods at all. And what is it that they're doing that's interesting? So I don't know where this goes. I mean, this could go into a kind of development group. We could spend some time in SCiO development days exploring the space a bit more. What occurred to me, though, was that if you're a practitioner figuring out what to do, it is not a clear space for you to be able to figure out how to access this. And as I said, the only place that feels structured and guarantees that you will learn some theory and some practice is the apprenticeship. But that is incredibly narrow in terms of its scope. So, if I thought about my global citizen head on for a minute, I go, it only operates in England. Right, okay, well, that's just a tad limited in terms of what it might have as an impact. So, thoughts, questions, critique?
Well, I was typing, but you invited, so I won't bother to type. I typed this bit. It's a problem that's not unique to systems thinking. I think other disciplines, if I may call it that, share this. And I think systems thinking is uniquely cursed by a terrible name. And in pursuit of a better name, I was just trying to think of something. But I ordered this for the Open University Library because I thought it was.
Oh, it's Mike's book, is it? Is that the practitioner one?
Yeah, I thought it was. I mean, it's brand new, but anyway, I thought we needed it in the library, and we have it. And because I ordered it, I grabbed it first. And you can see I've got some pages in it. I have to just have a little whinge about modern book publishing. It's shit. They try to save money, and everything is the narrow margins and a lousy index that just is basically the list of people's names. I think it's awful. Anyway, that's beside the point. I didn't pay for the book, so I shouldn't really complain. So two things come out of that. Number one is he's done a pretty decent trawl of all sorts of flavors of the word systems and thinking, and there are many. I mean, an absurd amount. And a bit like leafing through a dictionary, I found things that I just loved. So, for instance, I've just ordered a book from Abe, a proper book, old-fashioned, about IP, which was Akoff's way of participatory planning, I think of it.
Interactive planning.
There you go, yeah.
There it is, Russ. It's one of the 13.
Well done. Yeah, very well done.
Methods.
Anyway, I hadn't come across it, but it does sound like the sort of thing that I did as a lay practitioner. That was my. I wanted to find out more, and there's a very good paper by somebody called Haftor, who actually tested this out in Sweden in a pharmaceutical company to find out if it worked. So if anybody's interested, there's a good paper on that. Anyway, we have this bad name, so people don't know that they need systems thinking until they've learned a bit about systems thinking. It's not exactly as you say, it's not taught to anybody. AI will change a lot of this because, of course, they will have to teach children new things because everything that's already known will be available. There's no point in teaching them that. So, we will see, a bit of a change. And then the other thing that I wanted to say from here is Mike would suggest that in looking at the problem as you did, which I think is excellent work, by the way, in looking at it, he would suggest that you want to go through 5 different perspectives of it. The mechanical, the interrelationship, the organismic, purposeful, and societal, environmental. And then, having done that, you then select the mixture of methodologies that are appropriate. Now, VSM is very much an organism, it's the idea that you've got an organism. And I think it's probably inappropriate for this because systems thinking is not an organism. It's not like a living company. It's just not. So he would probably suggest, and we could invite him to talk about this, he would probably suggest, maybe there's a different lens, and it's probably the societal environmental lens, which of course is the most difficult. And he would probably then say that the tool, the methodology for that is critical systems heuristics or emancipatory systems. How could systems thinking education help us get out of the problems that we're facing societally? So that's my contribution. But I think it's a fascinating piece of work, and thank you for bringing it to the group.
Yeah, because I think Mike effectively, it sounds like Mike's book helps you deal with this key or cone view of the world, which is which key am I going to use?
Yeah, I think
sense of the situation.
Yeah. And one thing that I think he's to be congratulated, because at first I just thought, oh yeah, it's a meta system, but I think he's to be congratulated for bringing together a kind of a grand unifying theory or a grand unifying framework that lets you use all of the systems thinking, albeit he's got a bit of a plan, do, check, adjust, cycle to apply it, but that's okay. So yeah, I think it's a really good effort. It's much better if you listen to him talk about it. It just trips off the tongue.
Thanks, Ross. There's one to check out then.
Can I come a little bit left field from this?
Yes.
So in the engineering fraternity, chemical engineering is a bit of the systems thinking of engineering, because, either or process engineering, because ultimately you have to put all the bits together. You have to create an interrelated thing. So unwittingly, a lot of the chemical, because it's not just a pot, it's not a nut or a bolt. You put a pot, and then it has to have until you put things that only have emergent property together. Yeah, so they are a place you can lean into looking to how they handle their learning, because you have to have a certain breadth, and then you can get into that sort of pie shape or that slight key shape. But I think leading back to what Russ was saying about in the book, the key, overuse the word key, but one of the real tricks of being the depth of the leg of your T is knowing where it connects back, how you move from one to the other. Well, this is my deep expertise. How does this connect to other legs of the comb, of which I may not be as good? And then where can I find people? But it's understanding how it connects. It's like, I am absolutely brilliant at VSM, but I have no idea how it connects to any other part of VSM. So chemical engineering example, so you're absolute expert in heat transfer, but if you don't understand how it comes to reaction design, then you're just really, all you're doing is really following somebody else's instruction, because you can't push it into another envelope space. And if you look at the way the IChemE structure is becoming chartered, which is an interesting space to explore, you have to demonstrate your ability to practice on different legs of the comb when you apply, when you do your, well, they've changed the name. It used to be the training and experience report. There is a presumption, having done your degree, you have the base theory knowledge, and then you have to practice for a certain period of time, and then you have to demonstrate competence in a number of areas to become chartered. And I think they've shifted it. Key one always, if you had to do safety, then you had to do 3 out of 5 other core subjects, and then you could do a mishmash of the remainder. Show that I have touched upon this, and part of the key was being able to show how it all interrelated.
Interesting.
Food for thought. It's sort of a similar issue faced by a different academic space.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because that also relates in a bit of the way to how we use the competency framework to assess people who just want to do competency framework assessment. And whilst I love the competency framework assessment, because I think it's really good for people to get an understanding of where they are, it doesn't necessarily help them to figure out where they want to go. So the trajectory part of it still remains a challenge. Where do I want to go, and why do I want to go where I want to go? So that still remains a bit of a difficult quandary for people in a discipline as broad as this to make decisions about what do I want to do, where do I want to get it from, what do I want it to look like, how much practice do I want to be in it?
Yeah, it's all about the definition of a profession, isn't it? And the standards laid down by its professional bodies.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, just
I come from software development, where basically anybody could make up a title, put it on LinkedIn, and get hired. And the kind of code that you see running our banks is evidence of that. It's appalling. I mean, a lot of it is just appalling.
It's
Sorry to tell you that, guys.
but it's to lean back to the chemical engineers. I mean, you can have them, pharmaceutical manufacturer, bread manufacturer. There's a lot in the food industry, oil and gas. They'll all have started from the same theoretical background. I mean, almost all the UK degrees will have, and then the American ones have the same core bits. But once anybody's been practicing in oil and gas, you have experience, and there's a particular art, there's a craft that you learn in that field. So you studied VSM, you get really good with the craft of VSM. You might know what critical systems heuristics is, you might know some connection, but somebody who's been practicing in that field. And the key thing is about being able to recognize the difference. Partially because of its history now, employers can appreciate the difference. I think that's part of where that's part of the disconnect at the moment. How does somebody who needs thinking know what the hell they need?
Yeah.
How do you filter out terrible programmers from good programmers?
And I think that's part of what the apprenticeship
Yeah.
is, because it gives you you have a level 7 apprenticeship, you have attained a practice-oriented qualification, and that feels unique, and it's what Ray Eisen wanted in the first place. One of the reasons the apprenticeship exists was he was saying, organizations are producing systems thinking practitioners who go and mess up their own organizations because they can't actually practice effectively.
And that goes back to what Russ has just said about professionalism. And I think that is really key, actually, because I think realistically, since I took on the apprenticeship, I think, it was fantastic opportunity for me. It didn't change the work that I'm doing yet. Hopefully it will in time. People were very pleased that I passed, and I got sort of a lot of well done, dear type comments, but not really noticing what that might mean for the organisation or the work that I've been doing along the way, and recognising what opportunities they were actually missing by not sort of involving me at that level. And it's a real tough one, actually. It's quite frustrating, but then I'm really, really stubborn, and I sort of hope that that's sort of keeping me in and I've got a huge project coming up allegedly tomorrow, systems thinking. I will be talking about, I will be thinking with people carefully with the language about what is it we want to achieve, and why is that, and what is the mess now.
Thank you, Sharon. Useful reflection.
Very good.
We've come, I think, to the end of the time. We've actually slightly run over the end of the time we